Imagine you are sitting in a meeting. Someone throws out an idea, and within seconds, three people have layered opinions on top of it, and the room has agreed the idea is good. You are still thinking. You have a reservation forming, a real one, something about the second assumption that does not quite hold. But the conversation has already moved 2 stops down the line, and to raise your hand now would mean dragging everyone backward. So you say nothing. The meeting ends. Everyone agrees it was a productive meeting. And you walk out carrying the thing you did not say, wondering, not for the first time, whether the problem is the meeting or whether the problem is you. Susan Cain's argument, in the book Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking, is that the problem is not you. The problem is a set of cultural assumptions so deeply installed that we have stopped noticing they are assumptions at all. We have come to believe that the ideal self is gregarious, quick to speak, comfortable in the spotlight, and at ease among strangers. We have built our schools around that ideal, and our offices, and our hiring processes, and our definitions of leadership. And in doing so, Cain argues, we have quietly mislaid something like 1/3 to 1/2 of the population, along with a large share of the insight, the caution, the depth, and the originality that those people bring. This is not a book about shyness, and it is not a self-help book that promises to make you louder. It is something more interesting and, I think, more useful. It is a work of cultural history that asks how we arrived at this particular ideal, a work of popular science that asks what temperament actually is at the level of the nervous system, and a work of practical advice that asks what to do about it on a Tuesday afternoon in an open-plan office. Over the next stretch, I want to walk you through what Cain is actually claiming, where the claims come from, where I think they are strongest, and where I think they need pressure applied. Because the book has been so successful and its central terms so thoroughly absorbed into ordinary speech that there is a risk of it becoming a comfortable slogan rather than an argument. It deserves better than that. Susan Cain came to this subject from inside the machine she is describing. She is an honors graduate of Princeton and of Harvard Law School, and she practiced as a lawyer before she became a writer. That biography matters more than a biography usually does, because corporate law is one of the purest expressions of the culture Cain is diagnosing. It is a profession that selects for verbal quickness, that rewards the person who fills silence, that treats a certain kind of adversarial performance as a proxy for competence. Cain was successful in it. She was also, by her own telling, temperamentally at odds with it. The book grows out of that friction, and you can feel it in the prose. This is someone who did not read about the extrovert ideal in a journal. She lived inside it and eventually decided to describe it. Quiet was published by Crown in hardcover in January of 2012. Its full title is Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking, and that subtitle is doing a lot of work because it locates the argument not in the introvert but in the world. The book became a #1 New York Times bestseller. By the accounting on Cain's own site, it went on to spend 8 years on that list, sell more than 4 million copies, and appear in more than 40 languages. That is not ordinary success. That is a book that found a nerve and pressed on it, and the scale of the response is itself a piece of evidence for the thesis. A great many people, it turns out, had been waiting for someone to tell them that their inwardness was not a defect. The same year the book appeared, Cain gave a TED Talk called The Power of Introverts, which has since been viewed more than 30 million times, making it one of the most watched talks the organization has ever hosted. There is a lovely irony there that Cain herself has acknowledged, a self-described introvert standing on the most extroverted stage in the world, having spent a year rehearsing, to argue that we should stop demanding that everyone stand on stages. She has continued the work since. She wrote Quiet Power, The Secret Strengths of Introverted Kids, which turns the argument toward adolescence, and in 2022 Crown published Bittersweet, How Sorrow and Longing Make Us Whole, which extends her interest in the value of states we have been taught to treat as problems. If Quiet defends the person who does not want to talk, Bittersweet defends the person who does not want to be cheerful. There is a single project underneath both, a suspicion that our culture's official emotional menu is too narrow, and that the items it has crossed off are not the weak ones. I want to name one thing about my own account here. There is a detail that circulates widely about Cain, that she worked as a negotiations consultant. I could not confirm it against a source I trust, so I am setting it aside rather than repeating it. The book's argument does not lean on it, and the habit of checking is exactly the sort of thing the book, at its best, is arguing for. The structural spine of Quiet is worth knowing because it tells you how Cain thinks. After an author's note, she opens with an introduction called The North and South of Temperament, and then moves through 4 parts before closing with a conclusion titled Wonderland. The 4 parts are, in order, the extrovert ideal, then your biology, yourself, then do all cultures have an extrovert ideal, and finally, how to love, how to work. Read those 4 titles in sequence, and you can see the whole architecture. First, here's the water we are swimming in. Second, here is what is actually happening in your body. Third, is any of this necessary, or is it just us? Fourth, given all that, what do you do on Monday? Part 1 makes what I think is the book's most genuinely startling move, which is to historicize a trait we experience as timeless. Cain argues that the American preference for the outgoing personality is not an eternal feature of human societies, but a relatively recent invention, traceable to a shift around the turn of the 20th century. Before that shift, she argues, the operative ideal was character, what you were when nobody was watching, your integrity, your duty, your restraint. Afterward, the operative ideal became personality, how you came across, whether you were magnetic, whether people liked you in the first 90 seconds. Cain gives this new figure a name borrowed from the period's own self-improvement literature. He is the mighty likable fellow. What drove the shift, on this account, was the movement of Americans from farms and small towns, where you were known over decades by people who had watched you grow up, into cities and corporations, where you were a stranger among strangers and had to be evaluated fast. In a world of strangers, the surface becomes the evidence. If nobody has time to learn your character, they will read your personality instead, and so it becomes rational, individually rational, to invest in the surface. An entire industry rose to help. Self-improvement books stopped teaching virtue and started teaching charm. Advertising discovered that it could sell products by suggesting that you were being judged and found wanting. And the emblematic figure of that industry, the man who taught a generation of anxious clerks how to be liked, was Dale Carnegie, whose own trajectory from a Missouri farm boy to a master of public speaking is, as Cain reads it, the whole cultural transition compressed into a single life. I find this section persuasive and also worth handling carefully. The strong version of the claim would be that introversion was fine until about 1920, and that is not quite what the historical record supports, nor is it quite what Cain says. Human groups have probably always rewarded the confident talker to some degree. What changed, and what Cain documents well, is the industrialization and intensification of that reward, its codification into hiring practices and school design and the very furniture of the workplace, until a preference hardened into an assumption, and an assumption hardened into an ideal that could be neither seen nor questioned. That is the real target. Not that anyone likes extroverts, but that we have built institutions which cannot imagine the alternative. From there, Cain moves to leadership, and this is where the book stops being a cultural essay and starts making empirical claims that have consequences for how organizations actually run. The extrovert ideal produces a simple heuristic: the person who talks the most is the leader. Cain's objection is that we have confused the sound of leadership with the substance of it. She spends time inside Harvard Business School, which she treats as a kind of laboratory for the ideal in its purest form, a place where class participation is a large share of the grade, where students are explicitly coached to speak before they are certain, and where the institutional theory of leadership is essentially that leaders are people who project confidence and then bring others along. She is careful not to caricature it. There are real virtues in a place that teaches people to commit and act under uncertainty. But she notices what the training optimizes for, which is the appearance of conviction, and she notices what it therefore does not optimize for, which is the recognition of one's own uncertainty. Against that, she sets research suggesting the relationship between extroversion and effective leadership is contingent rather than automatic. The most useful finding she reports, associated with work by Adam Grant and colleagues, concerns the interaction between a leader's temperament and the people being led. When employees are passive and waiting for direction, an extroverted leader does well, energizing a room that needs energizing. But when employees are proactive, when they arrive with ideas of their own, the pattern reverses. The extroverted leader, driven to put a personal stamp on the room, can unintentionally crowd those ideas out. The introverted leader, more comfortable listening than performing, lets the ideas through, and the group does better. The point is not that introverts lead better. The point is that the match matters, and that a culture which selects for one type at every gate has thrown away half the possible matches without ever running the comparison. Cain reinforces this with figures whose contributions came precisely from not seeking the room's attention. The publisher's own framing of the book names Rosa Parks, Chopin, Dr. Seuss, and Steve Wozniak. That list rewards a moment of thought, because it is not a list of quiet people who succeeded despite being quiet. It is a list of people whose contributions are hard to imagine coming from anyone else. Rosa Parks is the sharpest case. The mythology remembers a single act of refusal, but the power of that act came from a lifetime of unshowy, disciplined, meticulously prepared organizing, and from a presence that read as immovable rather than loud. Cain's reading is that Parks demonstrated something the extrovert ideal cannot account for, that moral force and volume are entirely separate variables, and that a movement needed both the orator and the woman who simply would not move. The third strand of Part 1 is the one I suspect has changed the most minds, because it lands on a practice nearly everyone has to endure. Cain names a phenomenon she calls the new groupthink, the conviction, now close to unquestioned in schools and corporations, that creativity is fundamentally social, that ideas emerge from interaction, and that therefore the way to get more ideas is to put more people in more rooms together more often. Its physical expression is the open plan office. Its procedural expression is the brainstorming session. Its educational expression is the classroom rearranged into pods where children do most of their work in groups. Her objection is that on the specific question of generating ideas, the evidence has been pointing the other way for decades, and we have declined to look. Group brainstorming, studied repeatedly since the mid-20th century, tends to produce fewer ideas and lower-quality ideas than the same number of people thinking alone and pooling their results afterward. The finding is old, it is robust, and it is almost universally ignored. Cain walks through the mechanisms. There is social loafing, where individual effort dissolves into the group. There is production blocking, where only one person can talk at a time, so everyone else is either waiting or listening rather than generating. And there is evaluation apprehension, the entirely reasonable fear of looking foolish in front of colleagues, which quietly filters out precisely the strange, half-formed, potentially valuable ideas that a brainstorm is nominally there to surface. The open plan office draws a similar critique. Sold as a machine for serendipitous collision, it turns out to reliably deliver noise, interruption, and a diminished sense of control over one's environment, with measurable costs to concentration and, in several studies, to health and satisfaction. Cain's argument is not that collaboration is worthless, and I want to be precise about this, because it is the most common misreading of the book. She is arguing that we have taken one mode of work, the social mode, and made it mandatory and continuous, and in doing so we have made the other mode, the solitary mode, nearly impossible to obtain. Deliberate practice, the kind of concentrated and often lonely work that actually builds expertise, requires solitude almost by definition. You cannot get better at a hard thing while being interrupted every 11 minutes. Her exhibit here is Steve Wozniak, and it is a nicely double-edged choice. Wozniak designed the machine that launched Apple mostly alone, at night, at his desk, over a long stretch of solitary and obsessive work. But he was also a member of the Homebrew Computer Club, and the excitement of that community is part of what set him going. So the honest reading is not solitude good, groups bad. It is that the two serve different functions and need to be sequenced rather than blended. The group gives you the spark and the standard. The solitude gives you the thing itself. A culture that offers only the first and calls it innovation has kept the ceremony and lost the work. Part 2 turns from culture to the body, and it is here that Cain does the most to convert a personality label into something with physical substance. The foundational work she draws on is Jerome Kagan's decades-long research at Harvard on infant temperament. Kagan exposed 4-month-old babies to novel stimuli, unfamiliar sounds, new smells, moving objects, and observed how they responded. Roughly a fifth reacted vigorously, thrashing and crying. He called them high reactive. About twice as many stayed placid, and he called them low reactive. The intuitive prediction is that the thrashing babies grow into bold adults and the calm ones into timid ones. Kagan found the reverse. The high-reactive infants were disproportionately likely to become the quiet, careful, watchful children and adults we would call introverted. The low-reactive ones tended toward the outgoing. Once you see why, the whole picture reorganizes. A high-reactive nervous system is not a fearful one. It is a sensitive one. It takes in more, registers more, is stimulated more by the same amount of input. The infant thrashes because the mobile is a lot. The adult declines the party for exactly the same reason, at exactly the same setting on the same dial. On this reading, introversion is not a deficit of sociability. It is a difference in the optimal level of stimulation. Both temperaments seek the same thing, which is to sit at the level of arousal where they function best. They simply need different amounts of world to get there. The extrovert at the quiet dinner is underfed and reaches for the noise. The introvert at the party is overfed and reaches for the door. Neither is broken. They are thermostats set to different numbers, and the tragedy of the extrovert ideal is that it declared one setting healthy and the other a condition to be managed. Cain connects this to related work on high sensitivity, notably Elaine Aron's, which describes people who process sensory and emotional information unusually deeply, are moved strongly by art and by other people's distress, and are worn down by environments that others do not notice. The overlap with introversion is substantial without being total, and Cain uses it to argue that sensitivity carries advantages we have refused to price. The person who feels the room is the person who catches the problem early. Then, crucially, she refuses to let this become determinism. That is what the question mark in the part title, Your Biology, Yourself, is doing. She reports the rubber band metaphor she draws from this literature. Temperament stretches, but only so far, and it is yours. You can extend well beyond your resting point when something is at stake. You cannot become a different rubber band, and the attempt to do so by force produces exhaustion rather than transformation. Biology sets the range. What you do inside the range is up to you. And in the same part she takes on the cult of cool, the pose of unbothered nonchalance, arguing that it is one more costume the extrovert ideal sells and one more thing that a person built for depth pays too much to wear. Part 3 asks the question that any good cultural argument must eventually face. If the extrovert ideal is really a construction rather than a fact of nature, then somewhere it should be constructed differently. Otherwise, we are just describing human beings. Cain's answer is that it is indeed constructed differently, and she anchors the discussion in the experience of Asian Americans, particularly in settings like Cupertino, where children raised in families that prize listening, restraint, and deference to the group encounter an American school system that grades them on how readily they speak. What is striking in her treatment is that these children are not, in most cases, unable to speak. They are operating a different theory of when speech is appropriate, one in which talking before you have something worth saying is not confidence but rudeness. The American classroom cannot read that theory. It has one instrument, and the instrument measures volume, so a virtue is recorded as a deficiency. She pushes this further into adulthood, where the same collision shows up as the bamboo ceiling, the pattern by which quiet competence is repeatedly passed over for promotion in favor of visible assertion. And the point cuts both ways, which is what makes it valuable rather than merely flattering. It is not that one culture is right. It is that each has a blind spot exactly where the other has an eye. A culture organized around soft power gives up something real in speed and individual initiative. A culture organized around assertion gives up something real in listening and in the ability to be corrected. What Cain wants is not that we switch. It is that we notice we chose. I will say that this is the part of the book where I would want the most care taken by the reader, because arguments that map temperament onto ethnicity can slide very easily and without anyone intending it into the thing they were meant to critique. Cain is aware of this and works to stay on the right side of it, treating these as cultural norms that individuals inherit, negotiate, and sometimes reject, rather than as traits people possess. The reader has to do that work too. The useful takeaway is narrow and strong. The extrovert ideal is not the human condition, because there are large, successful, sophisticated societies that never adopted it. Part 4 is where the book turns practical, and it is more honest than most books get at this stage, because it declines to say that you should simply be yourself. The central tool is what Cain, drawing on the psychologist Brian Little, calls free trait theory. The idea is that we are all born with and culturally assigned certain fixed traits, but we can and routinely do act out of character in service of what Little calls core personal projects, the things we love, the people we are committed to, the work we consider our own. The introverted professor who lectures brilliantly is not faking and is not cured. He is spending his temperament as currency to buy something he cares about. This is a genuinely liberating reframe, because it dissolves the false choice between authenticity and effectiveness. You do not have to decide whether the real you is the quiet one or the one on stage. The real you is the one who chose what was worth the cost. But Cain is rigorous about the cost, and this is the part people forget. Acting out of character depletes you, physiologically, and if you do it without recovery, you break. So the theory comes with a required companion, the restorative niche, the place you go to return to yourself. The empty office between meetings. The walk. The drive home in silence. The bathroom stall, which Cain reports Little himself has used, and which I find the most humanizing detail in the book, because it says that this is not a lifestyle aesthetic, it is a physiological necessity, and you take it where you can get it. The rule that falls out of this is sharp and practical. You can spend far more than you think, provided you spend it on purpose and provided you have arranged in advance for where you will refill. She then applies this to relationships, where the recurring pattern is the introvert-extrovert couple caught in the conflict trap. One partner's instinct under stress is to escalate and resolve, because talking it through is how they process. The other's instinct is to withdraw and cool down, because processing requires quiet. Each reads the other's coping mechanism as an attack. The withdrawer looks like they do not care. The escalator looks like they are attacking. Neither interpretation is true, and the fights are, in a real sense, about nothing except a mismatch in the machinery. Cain's remedy is unglamorous and correct. Name the mechanism out loud, in advance, when you are not fighting. A withdrawal that has been explained is a pause. An unexplained one is an abandonment. Same behavior, opposite meaning. And she closes on children, which is where the stakes are highest, because a child cannot yet distinguish between "this environment does not suit me" and "there is something wrong with me." Her guidance to parents is to resist the reflex to fix. The quiet child does not need to be pushed into the pool and does not need to be protected from the pool either. What they need is to approach it at their own speed, with an adult nearby who is visibly not worried. The damage is rarely done by the party or the classroom. It is done by the message underneath the intervention, which the child hears with perfect clarity. The way you are is a problem we are trying to solve. Let me draw the threads together into the things I think are worth carrying out of this book. The first is that the extrovert ideal is a historical artifact, not a law. It has a beginning, roughly a century back, and a mechanism, the shift from communities of neighbors to societies of strangers, and a sales force, the personality improvement industry that grew up to serve the anxiety it created. Anything with a beginning can have an end, or at least an amendment. The second is that introversion is a preference about stimulation, not a fear of people. Kagan's high-reactive infants grew into the careful adults precisely because their nervous systems take in more, not less. This single reframe does more work than anything else in the book because it converts what feels like a moral failing into a specification. You do not have a character flaw. You have a threshold. Design around it. The third is that we have systematically confused the performance of leadership with the practice of it, and the cost is not paid by introverts. It is paid by every organization that promoted the loudest person in the room and then wondered why the good ideas stopped arriving. The fourth is that solitude is a working condition, not a personality quirk. The evidence on brainstorming and open plan offices has been available for decades, and we have overridden it because we like how collaboration feels. If you take one operational change from this book, make it this: separate idea generation from idea discussion. Have people think alone first, then bring the results together. It costs nothing and it works. The fifth is free trait theory with its bill attached. You can act out of character for what you love, and you should. You cannot do it indefinitely without restoration, and pretending otherwise is how capable people burn out while being told they are thriving. And the sixth, which is really the book's ethical center, the goal is not to make introverts into extroverts, and it is not to declare introverts secretly superior. It is to stop running a monoculture. A room that contains both the person who speaks to think and the person who thinks to speak is smarter than a room containing only one of them. The extrovert ideal's real crime is not unkindness. It is waste. I want to end with a caution and a claim. The caution is that quiet is easy to misuse, and its enormous success has made the misuse common. It can become a permission slip, a way of declining every difficult thing on the grounds that it is not your temperament. Cain does not offer that and would not endorse it. Free trade theory exists precisely because she believes you should stretch, hard and often, for the things that matter. The book is not a wall to hide behind. It is a description of the machine you are operating, offered so that you can operate it deliberately instead of blaming yourself for its specifications. The person who reads quiet and stops going to things has misread it. The person who reads it and starts choosing which things and arranging the recovery afterward has read it exactly right. The claim is that the book has already won more than it is given credit for. When Quiet appeared in 2012, the word introvert was mostly a diagnosis. Today, it is an ordinary self-description, used without apology, in offices that now, at least sometimes, offer a quiet room. That shift did not happen only because of one book. But one book named The Thing gave people a vocabulary for an experience they had been having wordlessly and made it discussable. That is what the 4 million copies and the 40 languages actually represent. Not a fad, but a very large number of people discovering simultaneously that they had not been alone, only quiet, and that these are not at all the same condition. So here is the question I would leave you sitting with. Think again about that meeting and the thing you did not say. Ask yourself honestly whether you stayed silent because you had nothing or because the room was built for a different nervous system and you were spending all your energy just being in it. And then ask the harder version, the one that applies whether you are quiet or loud. How many rooms do you run, or shape, or simply sit in, where someone else is right now holding the best idea in the room and has not been given 3 seconds of silence in which to offer it? That silence is not empty. It never was. We just built a world too loud to hear what was in it.